A surprising amount of people have Ouija boards just sitting in their closet somewhere collecting dust, and most people probably have never even used them. I found out what Ouija boards are when I was 16, and when I asked my parents if we had one in our house, my mom told me yes, she did have one buried somewhere in the closet with all the board games. That closet was in the basement by the laundry room, the small closet with a bunch of my parents' old stuff. I was intrigued to try using a Ouija board because I was slightly superstitious. I had my mom help me dig through this closet without disrupting the integrity and neatness of how she sorted everything in there. And lo and behold, eventually she finds this old dusty box that simply said Ouija and had two hands holding the piece that moves around the board called the planchette. The box was kind of falling apart on the edges, even though my mom said they'd only used it a couple times ever. The first thing I did was text a few of my friends to come use the Ouija board with me that weekend when I'd be home alone, to make it scarier. My friend Liam, who was 17, had a car, so he picked up my friend Jack and they came right over. It was like 9 p.m. It was dark out, obviously, and my parents were gone for a couple nights. My younger brother of 2 years, Adam, was also home, so I asked him to join as well. We were going to play on the floor in the loft, which was converted into my bedroom. We turned off the lights and then turned on a flashlight and put it on the floor in the corner of the room, pointed towards the board. All four of us sat on one side of the board and we held the planchette and started asking questions. None of us had ever done this before, so we asked basic questions. I said, if there's someone there, move the planchette. Then for the first time, it started to move to the word yes. Adam asked, how old are you? And the planchette moved from the number 6 to 7, 67. We looked at each other, and while I suspected one of them were moving it, and I'm sure the others did too, we all played along and didn't break immersion. We took turns asking questions. Eventually, I asked the board, are you a demon? And the planchette went to the word yes. At this point, we all laughed and broke immersion, knowing one of us was messing around. At that moment, the flashlight turned off, and all of us stopped laughing and got really scared. Who did that? Someone asked. But it was clearly none of us. The flashlight was all the way in the corner. I crawled to get it and kept pressing the button. It wouldn't turn back on. I turned on my bedside lamp, and I saw the freaked out expressions on my friend's and brother's face. I said that was the most terrifying moment for the battery to die, but also part of me believed it wasn't a coincidence. We stopped playing after that moment, and we even left my room and went to the backyard just because we were all freaked out being in the house at that moment. I had to sleep in that room that night though, and when my friends left and Adam eventually went to sleep, I knew I had to as well. I put the Ouija board back in the box and brought it downstairs out of my room. I just felt weird sleeping in the same room as it that night. As soon as I turned off the light, I just tried to go to sleep right away, not sitting on my phone for an hour or whatever like I usually do. As I was starting to finally drift off into a half-sleep state, something in my closet fell over. I immediately rose up and looked in the direction of a closet door. I flicked on the bedside lamp and walked over to the closet. It was a small walk-in closet where I kept some of my clothes. There's a light switch on the outside of the closet that turned on a single light bulb inside of it. I flicked it on and looked down at the crack at the bottom of the door. There were what looked to be two shadows cast by feet on the other side of the door. As soon as I saw this, I started screaming at him and ran to his room. I explained to him what I just saw and led him to my room to show him. When he came to my room, the light in the closet was still on, but the shadows at the bottom of the door weren't there anymore. I opened the door, and there was nobody in the closet, but there was something on the floor. It was a wooden box that I made in arts and crafts that I would put childhood memorabilia in. It somehow fell over and the contents spilled onto the floor. There is no draft in the world that would have knocked that over. It made no logical sense. I slept in my parents' bed that night and then the next, and for a week after that I slept in the spare bedroom. Eventually I would start sleeping in my own bed again, but I would never forget that night. I haven't touched a Ouija board since. I had never used a Ouija board until I was in my mid-20s. It was never something that interested me, but my friend George was very briefly talking to this girl who was into that sort of thing. Her name was Mandy. She was into exploring abandoned and allegedly haunted places. One day he invited me to go with them and her friend to this apparently haunted abandoned house about a half-hour drive away. He guaranteed me the friend was cute in order to entice me to go. I didn't have anything going on that night, so I said, why not? We would be doing this late at night. George picked me up first around 11 p.m., and then we drove to pick up the girls from this park. I had already met Mandy once, but not her friend. Her friend Carly had red hair, a nose ring, and sleeve on her right arm. Mandy had already been to this house before, and she said it was high in activity, a term I'd never heard till that point, but obviously could put together what she meant. I smiled a bit as she said it because I honestly laughed to myself. I don't believe in the paranormal myself, so I found it a little humorous. Mandy brought this big bag with her, so during the drive I asked what's inside. And then she goes and pulls out this box, a Ouija board box, and then she pulls out a candle. Then George said, oh, that's a surprise. Apparently her surprise to George was that we would be using a Ouija board in this abandoned house. I'm gonna be honest, that didn't sound super fun to me, but I was there for the adventure. Mandy directed George where to park when we got close. It was this really dark street with no streetlights, with an open field on one side and trees on the other. The house driveway was gated off, so we had to walk from there. We walked through some woods that led us to the backyard of the house. From there, Mandy led us to the back window that she climbed through last time. It was a bit high up, so we had to help the girls up. Then we just climbed in ourselves, and we walked around the house for a bit. All the furniture was still inside, but it was just decrepit. It hadn't been lived in for probably decades. I don't scare easily, and I must admit, being in there at night was very eerie. It would probably be terrifying alone. It was dead silent besides our footsteps on the creaky floors. There were some old portraits of people hung on the wall. They looked like they were taken in the 50s, which made me wonder how old this house was and what was the story behind it. Most likely the couple living there died and there was no family left to claim the house. Mandy set up the board on the floor and she lit these 2 candles. I could tell she was really into this stuff. She took lead with this, asking a bunch of spiritual questions. The planchette piece didn't move for the first few questions as she kept asking, is anyone there, can anyone hear, etc. Eventually, it started to spell out the word hello. I laughed and looked at George, who laughed back. But the girls were serious and even said stop laughing. Out of respect, I did stop smiling and put a serious face on. Mandy asked, what's your name? And the planchette moved around the board slowly to spell out the name Gregory. She then asked, how long have you been dead? And then it moved around to spell out 30 years. I didn't believe any of this for a second. I knew Mandy or Carly were doing this. This went on for some time, and we played along, until there was a huge thump from upstairs in the house. We all jumped and let go of the planchette. George said, is someone up there? And Mandy insisted it could be Gregory. Mandy and Carly put their hands back on the planchette and asked, Gregory, did you make that sound? And George and I stopped her and said we need to leave if someone's upstairs. Then we watched as the planchette moved to the word yes. At this point, George and I were convinced the girls were pranking us and that they had someone upstairs trying to scare us. Then we heard footsteps above us. There was no denying these sounds were footsteps. George and I agreed to go upstairs and check it out, expecting to find someone trying to prank us. The girls kept saying, no, come back down. We went up the extremely creaky steps and entered the first open door we found. It was a bedroom. The furniture and everything in the room was extremely decayed. And then there was this door, right in the corner of the room. Most likely a closet. It was cracked open, and we whispered to each other that we thought we heard something in the closet. I put my finger up to my lips to tell him to be quiet, and we listened. When we heard a clear exhale behind the door, we both quickly left the room. We hurried downstairs, expecting to find the girls still in the living room, but they were gone. The candles, the Ouija board, everything. There was just darkness in the house now. We didn't even hear them sneak out. We left through the window again in a hurry and ran to the car. George tried calling Mandy's phone multiple times, but it went straight to voicemail every time. She blocked him. They were nowhere to be found either. We went straight to the car and drove home. George never heard from that girl again. He only hung out with her 2 times. He didn't know where she lived or anything. We did form our own crazy theory that they were in fact trying to trap us somehow, and the footsteps upstairs were from somebody they knew. It's also possible they never left the house, and that they were hiding somewhere inside. The more superstitious out there may believe that we did in fact speak to a spirit, though, and something more supernatural was going on. In October of 2015, when I was a junior in high school, I was in my horror phase where I was obsessed with everything scary and supernatural. With Halloween coming up, I was also reading a lot of scary stories about Ouija boards and people's experiences with them. My curiosity was piqued, and so I ordered a Ouija board off Amazon. And when it arrived, I waited till a night our parents were not home to use it. I convinced my little sister to try it with me. We were at the dining room table with the lights dimmed, both of us holding the planchette. I asked the board some questions, and my sister and I both laughed because it was kind of awkward and funny. I started to move the piece around, trying to creep out my sister, but she knew it was me doing it. After a few minutes of doing this, we were starting to get bored and my sister wanted to stop. I said let's try for a few more minutes. After a little bit more waiting for the planchette to move from some unseen entity, we decided to give up. My sister went to her room after this and I went to mine. I looked up more Ouija board stories online and kept reading people's experiences with them. And then I looked up why it didn't work for us. Other people had said their first time using Ouija boards nothing had happened, so I decided I would try again. That night around 1 a.m., when my sister was already asleep, I went back down to the dining room and dimmed the lights again. I once again tried to use the Ouija board, asking similar questions as a few hours ago, just in a lower voice to not wake up my sister. I held the planchette with both hands, waiting for it to move, but it never did. Instead, I heard sounds from upstairs, like soft footsteps. It could have been my sister. She might have heard me down here. The footstep-type sounds were followed by a muffled female voice. It didn't sound quite like my sister, though, and the voice was coming from directly above me. The room above the dining room was our older brother's room, who was away at college. My sister wouldn't have been in there. I went up the stairs quietly, and I heard the voice getting louder as I got closer to my brother's room. It was coming from in there. I was curious if my sister was playing a prank on me, changing her voice to sound lower to scare me. I got to the door and put my ear up against it. I heard the voice of what sounded like an older woman. I wasn't sure how my sister could be doing a voice like that. At first I didn't know what was being said, until I realized that the voice kept saying, "Grandma's here, Georgie," over and over. It was the voice of my dead grandma. I felt every hair in my body stand up. I opened the door and turned on the light, and no one was inside. The voice had stopped. I ran to my room, had shut the door and locked it, and crawled up under the covers. I felt the whole room spinning as I couldn't form any rational thoughts of what just happened. It was too vivid to have imagined it. When I calmed down, I did a prayer before going to sleep. Or at least trying to go to sleep. I was awake all night. I still remember this night just as vividly, 8 years later. Senior year, I had just recently started dating my fiancé Mark. We were approaching the end of the school year, and so prom was coming up. I didn't really know if I wanted to go, because I had just finally changed all of my contact info, and my family moved to a new house because of my old stalker ex Daryl, who's 4 years older than me. I was 18 and he was 22. We met when I was going through a rough time in my life. Long story, but he turned out to be a psychotic asshole. He got kicked out of the army and started doing hard drugs like heroin. I distanced myself from him as much as I could, but he was relentless. He attempted to break into my family's home at least 3 times, and I had to get a restraining order against him. But my family was worried for me, and for all of us, so we had to move to another house. The reason I was hesitant about going to prom was because I knew my ex Daryl knew about it. We used to talk about going to my prom together. Ever since our move, my friends would drive me home and make sure we weren't followed. I really lived in fear. I was scared Daryl would show up to the prom venue and try to find me. Mark has always been very understanding and supportive, and he assured me he wouldn't tell me to go to prom if he didn't think it would be safe. He made me feel comfortable with it. We and our friends went in a limousine together to the venue, which was a fancy catering hall about 30 minutes away. We all sat at our table and had food and just hung out for a while. Some people went to dance, Mark and I included, for a while. I couldn't help but be paranoid for a while that Daryl was in the building somehow. One of Mark's friends handed me a little shot bottle of vodka and told me it would calm my nerves. I drank it in the bathroom and almost threw up, but within half an hour it really did take the edge off. A few hours later, our group wanted to leave for what's called the after prom, where you basically start drinking and continuing the party elsewhere with your friends. As we walked outside of the venue to our respective rides, I saw one car parked in front of the venue that didn't have its lights on. I didn't know what Daryl drove at that point, or if he drove, but I saw someone sitting in it. They had a baseball hat on and were looking down, so I couldn't see their face. I pointed it out to Mark. He told me to relax, there's no way it's him. We got in our friend's car who was picking us up, and we drove to our friend Melissa's house, who was having a little after party. The whole ride I kept looking behind us, seeing if we were being followed, but I couldn't tell because there were so many cars on the road. I remember Mark whispering to me, "Relax, everything's fine," and he held my hand, and it helped calm me down so much. We arrived to Melissa's house, and there were already people at her house. At the peak of the night, I'd say there were 20 people there, and everyone was drinking. Eventually, Mark and I wanted to go home, so Mark called his sister to come pick us up, and when she got there, we went straight out to her car. I looked around the street for any sketchy-looking cars but didn't see anything, and at this point, I officially convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Mark's sister drove us back to their house where I would be sleeping over. It was just his mom and his sister home. His dad is a retired cop, but he was still working at the time, and he was working a late shift that night. His mom was already asleep, it was very late. Mark and I just went downstairs to his room to crawl into bed. The whole den floor of the house was his floor. It had a mini kitchen, a bedroom, and living room. His floor was level with the backyard, and so it had a back door. It was a warm night, so some of the windows were cracked open. We were watching a funny movie. That was when we heard a bang on the glass door that led to the backyard. The sliding curtain was covering the door, so we couldn't see who or what did it. I shrieked and Mark jumped up to open the curtain. No one was on the other side, but there was a post-it note slapped on the door with the word "bitch" on it. He found me. He followed me from the prom to Melissa's house to here, and he probably heard me laughing and knew I was down here. My paranoia was right all along. We went upstairs to Mark's mom's room and woke her up, then called Mark's dad and the police. Waiting for Mark's dad and the rest of the police to arrive felt like an actual eternity. When the doorbell finally rang, followed by loud knocks, Mark and his mom went to go answer the door. It was the police. I had to explain the whole story with my ex, and the restraining order, and now being followed by him here. They asked if there were any cameras on the property, to which Mark's mom said no. Then they asked me if I had any texts from him, or if perhaps I knew where he lived. I told them I didn't have his number anymore, and I had no idea where he lived anymore either. Mark's dad finally arrived on the scene. I took the post-it note from the door home with me to try and compare it to other handwriting from Daryl, and it definitely matched. Mark's dad gave me a ride to my house in his police car so that we could be sure I wouldn't be followed. During the ride home, I called our home phone and my dad picked up. I cried to him into the phone hysterically. After arriving home, my parents were waiting in the front for me. Mark's dad assured my parents we weren't followed. During this period, Mark and I couldn't go to each other's houses. Mark's parents had security cameras installed the same week, and this next part is truly unbelievable. One of the side cameras on their property picked up motion, which alerted Mark's dad's phone. He grabbed his gun and ran outside to the smell of gasoline. He followed the smell until he heard the sound of liquid being poured out of a can, and there he saw Daryl pouring out gasoline on the sides of their house. With his gun drawn, Mark's dad yelled at him to drop the can and put his hands up, and that was the moment Daryl was no longer going to be a threat to my or my loved ones' lives. I call it the sweetest justice that my future fiancé's cob dad was the one to arrest my psychotic ex-boyfriend who ruined so many years of my life and had me living in worry. He was sentenced to over 30 years for his crimes, the worst of which, of course, was attempted arson on a police officer's house. It was 2017. I was 17 getting ready for prom. And of course, girls have it harder because instead of the guys who just rent the same tuxedos, girls have to find a nice dress that they're gonna keep. And of course, prom dresses aren't cheap, if you want a nice one at least. My parents didn't want to spend over $200 for a prom dress, so my mom suggested I look online for a used one. She'd even help me. We scrolled on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, which had just become a thing back then. It wasn't as popular as it is today. There wasn't really any luck on Facebook Marketplace, so we mainly searched Craigslist. We found a listing for a dress that we both liked. It was a navy blue evening gown, $50. It said it was worn once for prom. The seller lived pretty close too, so I contacted the number listed on the listing, and in under 10 minutes I got a text back. After expressing my interest and asking a couple sizing questions, the person offered to come to our house to drop it off to us. But my mom said no to having someone from Craigslist come to our house. So I said we'd come to them that day. I asked for their name and they said Alex. Honestly, I assumed that Alex was short for Alexandra. My mom offered to come with me. I felt more comfortable if she'd drive me. When we got to the address, it was a townhouse in a congested area of town. The townhouse was on a dead end. My mom asked if I wanted her to come in with me, and honestly, I don't know why, but I thought it would be embarrassing to go in with my mom. I asked her to just wait in the car unless I text her. I texted Alex, and then I went to ring the doorbell. I noticed all the blinds on the windows were closed, which was strange. It was the middle of the day. The door opened, and instead of some young girl around my age opening the door, it was an actual grown man, like 50 years old. He smiled and asked if I was here for the dress. I said, "Yeah, are you Alex?" And he said, "Yeah." He said I looked just like his daughter, and then said, "Come inside." I looked back at my mom's car and then went inside the house. He said I should be a perfect fit for the dress. He said he'd go get it, then disappeared into another room. The living room was dark and kind of messy. I took out my phone and texted my mom to come to the front door. Then the man called out from a room for me to come inside and try the dress on in front of a mirror. I asked him if he could bring the dress out to the living room. He said there's no mirror in the living room, and I replied that I'd just like to see the dress first. He left the room and entered the living room empty-handed, and said the dress is on the bed in the bedroom if I want to go look at it. I once again asked him to please just bring it out here. Then a knock at the front door. Alex said, "Who is that?" And I opened the door to my mom stepping inside. She smiled and said hello to the man, and he took a couple seconds to say hello back, but without a smile. Now I walked to the doorway of the bedroom, and as I did, he made a noise as if to say, "Don't go in there." I looked into the dark bedroom, and there was no dress on the bed. My mom was in the middle of asking a question when I interrupted and said that there's no dress. There was a painfully uncomfortable and tense silence, and then the man said, "I'd like you to leave now." My mom and I, without hesitation, left to the car. By the time we were in the car, the front door was already closed, and I saw the man peering through the kinked blinds. We were both in shock. If my mom hadn't come in, I don't know what would have happened. I reported the Craigslist ad. He didn't call the police though, because there was really no proof of anything, and technically nothing happened. But there was no blue dress in that room. He was just trying to get me into that room, and when my mom came in, he couldn't exactly do that anymore. Thank God I listened to my mom and didn't give him our address. I ended up getting a used dress shipped to me. That prom night I told everyone this story, and it's still kind of haunting even today. In our high school class, there was a kid named Joshua that moved to our high school during freshman year, so I guess he had a hard time breaking into any of the established friend groups. He had a few friends here and there from what I know, but he wasn't part of any particular groups. But then something really awkward happened one day during lunch. I had already asked my date Natalie to prom and she said yes. At lunch we had a table of mixed guys and girls, and Natalie was at the table. Here came Joshua from whatever table he was sitting at, and like an awkward scene out of a movie, he taps Natalie on the shoulder and asked her to prom. The whole table went silent except for one kid who cheered sarcastically. Then Natalie laughed in clear discomfort and said she's already going with me. I felt the second-hand embarrassment. Joshua looked at me, and I didn't know what to think of the stare he gave me, but I could tell he was humiliated. He left without saying a word, and everyone laughed loudly. It was a horribly uncomfortable scenario all around. While I felt bad, I couldn't help but slightly laugh too. I mean, I have no idea what he thought was going to happen, especially with such a large audience of dudes at the table too. We watched as Joshua actually left the cafeteria, and the teacher on lunch duty actually chased after him because you weren't allowed to leave without a pass. But Joshua never came back into the lunchroom. I still wonder where he went from there. On prom night, we had our group of 10 in the back of the limo. The same 10 of us sat at the table together when at the dance. Everything was going as prom should. But then, eventually that night, one of my friends told me, "Don't look now, but Josh was at that table eyeballing you." I waited like 10 seconds before looking over, and I saw Joshua shooting a dagger at, I guess, Natalie and I. I decided I'd go talk to him. But as I walked over to him, he got up and hurried away out of the dance hall. That was super weird, but I wasn't going to chase after him. I went over to the table he was sitting at and asked a couple of the kids if they came with Joshua, and they said no, he kinda just sat there randomly and wasn't saying anything. I went back to my table, and like a typical high schooler, I told the whole table. It was definitely pretty freakish. After prom, Natalie and I left with a friend who drove to go to a diner to eat a bunch of breakfast food at like 12 a.m. After that, we went to our friend Anthony's house. He had a massive backyard right next to a nature preserve, and he had a really cool fire pit. So we all circled the fire pit with a speaker playing music and some drinks. There were 6 of us total. Anthony, sitting across from me, pointed out to the woods and said he saw something in the woods. We all looked over, of course. We looked at the woods for a while, but when we didn't see anything, Anthony basically said, whatever. We continued to hang by the fire pit for a while. Eventually one couple left, so it was just Natalie, Anthony, his date, and myself left. Anthony was mid-sentence when he stopped speaking abruptly. I said, "What?" And I turned around and saw someone walking towards the light of the fire from the woods. It was someone in a tuxedo. He said to us, "Don't get up." As he got closer, we realized it was Joshua. He was holding a hatchet or a small axe. He looked like he had been crying. He also looked angry. Anthony and I told him to please put the axe down and just talk. Joshua yelled at us to shut up, and he made us turn the music off. He began a rant about how soul-crushingly embarrassing what happened during lunch that day was, and how he had been too embarrassed to come back to school after that because he thought it had been spread all over the school. But it really hadn't, and we tried to tell him that. Anytime we tried to speak, he'd scream "shut the fuck up" louder and louder, and he'd begin to raise the axe kind of. He then directed his attention to Natalie and started going on about how he thought she was gorgeous, and that she would only make fun of him with her friends, which again, that never happened. All these things only happened in his head. During this time that he was talking to Natalie, Anthony was low-key and texted his dad something like, "Bring the gun to the backyard," making it clear we were in danger. Anthony's dad came out to the back door and yelled, "What's going on?" with his gun in his hand. Joshua stopped talking, and I could see he was deciding in his head whether to run or not. He dropped the axe and ran back to the woods. Anthony's dad came running over with his gun, and we all 4 of us couldn't tell him what happened quick enough. His dad said not to touch the axe, leave the fingerprints on it for the police. That hatchet, axe, whatever, was eventually the key to prosecuting Joshua after a few days. Joshua had already been arrested, and so his fingerprints were in the system, and they matched the fingerprints on the axe. But when all 4 of us decided we didn't want to press charges on Joshua, it was too late. By that point, he got charged criminally. Anthony's friend said it was for menacing in the 2nd degree. He didn't serve any jail time. I found Joshua on Facebook shortly after this and reached out to him with a sincere message, not attacking him at all, and he read it. He never replied to it. I saw Joshua one other time in the halls that year. He didn't look at me. None of us ever saw him again after graduation.